March 19, 1944, Frankfurt, Germany. The crisp morning air carried the scent of fresh bread and strong coffee from the small café nestled on Bahnhofstrasse, where Margarete Schneider arranged cups with practiced precision, believing her life would continue in the predictable rhythm it had maintained, despite the war raging across Europe. The young waitress had no way of knowing that in exactly 1 year, an American airman with talent beyond flying would change the course of her existence with nothing more than a pencil and paper. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how a forbidden artistic moment between enemies during the most devastating conflict in human history would remain buried for 4 decades, only to emerge and heal wounds that war had left festering across generations and continents. In the early spring of 1944, the Allied strategic bombing campaign against Germany was reaching unprecedented intensity. The United States Army Air Forces had committed to daylight precision bombing, a tactic that required clear skies and extraordinary courage. Among the air crews flying these dangerous missions was the 332nd Fighter Group, better known as the Tuskegee Airmen, the first African-American military aviators in the United States Armed Forces. First Lieutenant James Washington of the 332nd stood out even among this distinguished group. Born in Philadelphia to a high school art teacher and a postal worker, Washington had earned a scholarship to study fine arts at Howard University before the war interrupted his education. His commanding officer, Colonel Benjamin Davis, often joked that Washington was the only pilot who could accurately draw the enemy aircraft he had encountered in combat with museum-quality precision. Those Germans would probably offer you a job at their fancy art schools if they weren't so busy trying to shoot you down, Davis had remarked after seeing one of Washington's sketches of a Messerschmitt 109 fighter plane that had nearly ended his life over Turin. Washington had simply smiled. "Maybe after the war, sir, though I doubt my application would receive much consideration." His fellow pilot, Second Lieutenant Marcus Robbins, had laughed. "Are you kidding? The way you fly and the way you draw, they would make an exception." Washington's talent with a pencil was matched only by his skill in the cockpit of his P-51 Mustang, which he had named Charcoal Express in a nod to his artistic medium of choice. With a top speed of 437 miles per hour and a service ceiling of 41,900 feet, the P-51 was the perfect platform for escorting bomber formations deep into enemy territory. Washington had already been credited with 3 aerial victories, making him one of the unit's emerging aces. What made the Tuskegee Airmen remarkable went beyond their combat record. They were fighting 2 wars simultaneously, one against the Axis powers abroad and another against racial prejudice at home. Despite proving themselves repeatedly in combat, they faced discrimination that their white counterparts never experienced. "You know what's funny?" Washington once said to his wingman, Lieutenant Harold Thompson, as they prepared for a mission. "Up there, at 25,000 feet, with German fighters trying to kill me, that's where I feel most free." Isn't that something? Thompson had nodded solemnly, understanding exactly what his friend meant. 500 miles away in Frankfurt, Margarete Schneider was living a different kind of constrained existence. At 22 years old, she had already experienced more of war's hardships than many twice her age. The daughter of a university literature professor who had been removed from his position for questioning party policies, Margarete had been forced to abandon her own studies in languages to support her family by working at Café Heimat near the main railway station. Her father, once vibrant and outspoken, had become a shadow of himself, speaking only in whispers, even within their apartment. Her mother spent her days standing in ration lines and trying to stretch meager supplies into meals. Her younger brother, Friedrich, just 17, had been conscripted into the Volkssturm, the national militia established in the desperate final stages of the war. "You must be careful what you say at work, Margaret," her father warned her daily. "The walls have ears, and your careless words could mean our destruction." Margaret understood the warning all too well. 2 regular customers at the cafe were known Gestapo officers who watched patrons' reactions to news from the front. She had mastered the art of the non-committal smile, the careful nod, the diplomatic change of subject when conversations veered toward dangerous territory. Café Heimat's owner, Frau Bertha Müller, a widow in her 60s, had shown unexpected kindness to the Schneider family despite the risk to herself. When Margaret's father lost his position, Frau Müller had immediately offered Margareta work, even arranging for leftover food to be accidentally set aside for her to take home. "My husband was also a man who spoke his mind," Frau Müller had confided once when they were alone in the cafe after closing. "It cost him dearly before the war. I recognized the same courage in your father." By 1944, Allied bombing had transformed daily life in Frankfurt. Air raid sirens interrupted meals, conversations, and sleep. Citizens carried gas masks and knew the locations of all nearby bunkers by heart. The once bustling financial center had become a city of anxious glances skyward. Yet somehow, Café Heimat remained standing while buildings around it were reduced to rubble. A small miracle that Frau Müller attributed to her late husband watching over them from heaven. Margaret was less poetic, but equally grateful for each morning she arrived to find the café intact. It was during one such morning, as Margaret was arranging fresh flowers on the counter, another small miracle in wartime, that the bell above the door chimed, announcing the arrival of Brigadeführer Ernst Keller, one of the highest-ranking officers regularly seen in the café. A tall man with cold eyes and a perpetual frown, Keller commanded fear rather than respect. He was accompanied by two aides who never spoke, except to agree with whatever opinion the Brigadeführer expressed. "Fräulein Schneider," Keller said, removing his gloves with deliberate slowness, "I will take my usual table." Margaret nodded and led him to the corner table that offered a view of both the street and the entire café interior. Strategic positioning was second nature to men like Keller. "We have received fresh coffee this morning, Brigadeführer," she said, as she handed him the menu he never actually read. A rare treat these days. "Indeed," Keller replied, studying her face rather than the menu. "And how is your family, Fräulein? Your father still enjoying his early retirement?" The pause was deliberate, a reminder that he knew exactly why Professor Schneider no longer taught, and that the same fate, or worse, could befall the rest of her family. "He is well, thank you," Margaret answered, keeping her expression neutral. "He spends much time with his books." "Books?" Keller nodded thoughtfully. "One must be careful about books. They contain ideas, and ideas can be dangerous in the wrong minds." "He reads only the classics," Margaret said quickly. "Goethe, Schiller." "Approved literature, then," Keller smiled without warmth. "Very good. I will have the usual breakfast, and bring a newspaper." As the war progressed, the bombing campaign intensified. By late summer of 1944, the air war had reached a fever pitch. The Allies were flying missions almost daily when weather permitted, and the toll on both sides was staggering. The United States 8th Air Force alone had lost more than 9,000 airmen over Europe by this point. The German Luftwaffe, once seemingly invincible, was being systematically dismantled, losing irreplaceable veteran pilots, while fuel shortages kept training programs for replacements woefully inadequate. The average flying experience of German pilots had dropped from 250 hours to less than 180. For the Tuskegee Airmen, each mission was an opportunity to prove their worth. Their distinctive aircraft with red-painted tails had become recognized by the bomber crews they protected. Red Tail Angels, the bomber pilots called them, knowing that these fighters would stay with them even when other escort groups had to turn back due to fuel limitations. Lieutenant Washington had increased his victory count to 5 confirmed aerial victories, officially making him an ace. His reputation for aggressive protection of bomber formations had spread throughout the 15th Air Force. What few people knew was that he documented each mission in his sketchbook, not just the combat, but the people, the airfields, the landscapes passing thousands of feet below. "You should publish these after the war," Lieutenant Thompson told him one evening as they sat in their tent at Ramitelli Airfield in Italy, looking through Washington's latest sketches. "People back home need to see what it was really like." Washington shook his head. "These are just for me to remember." "Remember what? The times people tried to kill us?" Thompson laughed, but there was no humor in it. "To remember that I was here," Washington said quietly. "That I did this. That it mattered." Thompson was silent for a moment. "It matters, Jimmy. Don't ever doubt that." The reality of what mattering meant became devastatingly clear on September 28, 1944. The 332nd was assigned to escort bombers targeting synthetic oil plants in Germany. These facilities were crucial to the German war machine, converting coal into the fuel necessary for vehicles, aircraft and ships. Intelligence reports indicated heavy fighter resistance should be expected, as the Germans were desperate to protect these strategic assets. Colonel Davis had briefed his pilots thoroughly, emphasizing the importance of maintaining formation discipline and not being drawn away from the bombers they were protecting. Washington and Thompson were flying wing positions in Blue Section, one of four-ship formations comprising the squadron that day. The mission had proceeded smoothly until they crossed into German airspace, where radar-directed flak batteries opened up, filling the sky with black puffs of deadly shrapnel. "Blue 4, tighten it up," Washington called over the radio to a rookie pilot who had drifted slightly from formation. "Keep your interval." "Roger, Blue 3, came the tense reply from Second Lieutenant Calvin Morris, flying his second combat mission. They were approaching the target area when the German fighters appeared, at least 30 Messerschmitt 109 and Focke-Wulf 190 aircraft climbing to meet them. Unlike earlier in the war, these Luftwaffe pilots were now choosing to attack the fighters first, hoping to remove the bombers' protection before focusing on the larger aircraft. "Blue Section, break right!" The squadron leader's voice crackled over the radio as the German fighters bore in. "Engage defensive spread." What followed was 5 minutes of chaos that felt like 5 hours. Aircraft jinking and rolling, machine guns hammering, the sky filled with tracer fire and desperate radio calls. Washington found himself pursuing a Focke-Wulf that was lining up on one of the bombers. His P-51 closed the distance rapidly, its Packard-built Merlin engine screaming at full power. Washington pressed the firing button on his control stick, sending 650 caliber machine guns worth of fury at the enemy fighter. He saw strikes along the fuselage before the German aircraft rolled inverted and dived away, trailing smoke. He was about to follow when Thompson's voice came urgently over the radio. "Jimmy, 6 o'clock high." Washington reacted instantly, throwing his aircraft into a hard left brake just as tracer fire flashed past his canopy. The G-forces pushed him deep into his seat as he pulled the fighter through a tight turn, trying to spot the enemy that had nearly ended his life. There, a Messerschmitt, expertly flown, staying with his turn but firing too early, rounds passing harmlessly behind Washington's aircraft. Washington continued his turn, tightening it further, knowing that the Messerschmitt couldn't match the P-51's turning ability at this speed and altitude. The German pilot, realizing his disadvantage, broke off the engagement with a half roll and dived toward the safety of the clouds below. Washington let him go. Chasing single fighters away from the formation was exactly what the Germans wanted. "Thanks for the warning, Harold," Washington radioed to Thompson. "Any time, Jimmy. You still owe me $5 from that poker game anyway. Can't have you checking out before paying up." Washington laughed, tension momentarily broken, before rejoining the formation to continue their escort mission. It was only after landing during the debriefing that Washington learned Thompson had never made it back. His aircraft had last been seen pursuing a German fighter toward the ground, both aircraft damaged and trailing smoke. "No parachute was observed," the intelligence officer reported clinically. "Lieutenant Thompson is listed as missing in action, presumed killed." Washington sat silently as the rest of the debriefing continued around him. His hand moved automatically across his notepad, but instead of taking notes, he found himself sketching Thompson's face from memory. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat outside his tent under a brilliant canopy of stars, completing the sketch by flashlight. It wasn't just Thompson's features he captured, but something of his spirit. The slight smile that always seemed to play at the corner of his mouth, the confident look in his eyes. Colonel Davis found him there shortly before dawn. "So you should get some rest, Lieutenant," he said, sitting down beside Washington. "We have another mission tomorrow." Washington nodded, but made no move to return to his tent. "He was my best friend, sir." Davis was silent for a long moment. "I know. And he was an excellent officer. Another pause. That's quite good, he added, nodding toward the sketch. I keep thinking about what he said, Washington continued, as if he hadn't heard the compliment, about publishing these after the war. Making sure people remember. Then maybe you should, Davis said simply. But first we have to finish this thing, and that means you need sleep. Yes, sir, Washington replied, finally closing his sketchbook. The next morning, Washington flew again, this time with a new wingman, and the morning after that, and for many mornings that followed. The war continued, indifferent to individual loss. In Frankfurt, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Food was becoming scarcer, and bombing raids more frequent. The facade of inevitable German victory that had been maintained by propaganda was crumbling in the face of obvious military setbacks on all fronts. Café Heimat still operated, but with severely limited offerings. Coffee had become a luxury of the past, replaced by a bitter substitute made from roasted grains that fooled no one. Yet people still came, for the warmth, for the momentary escape from reality, for the human connection that became more precious as the world around them collapsed. Margaret continued her careful existence, walking the tightrope between necessary compliance and silent resistance. She smuggled extra food to an elderly Jewish couple hidden in Frau Müller's attic, passed along information about troop movements she overheard from military customers, and maintained her mask of pleasant servitude. Brigade Führer Keller remained a regular patron, though his visits had become less frequent as his duties took him elsewhere. The front was moving closer to Germany's borders, and men of his rank were increasingly needed to shore up crumbling defenses. On the rare occasions when he did appear, Margaret noticed changes in him. The confidence had given way to tension, the arrogance to barely concealed fear. His uniform, once impeccably maintained, showed signs of hasty care. The two aides who had accompanied him in the past had been replaced by a single nervous assistant who jumped at unexpected noises. They say the Americans are close to the Rhine, she overheard one customer whisper to another one morning in March 1945. It could be weeks, maybe days. The other customer, an elderly man, glanced nervously around the cafe before responding. The Russians are worse. Pray the Americans reach us first. Such conversations, unthinkable a year earlier, were becoming more common as the Reich's collapse accelerated. Margaret had learned to listen without appearing to do so, gathering information while maintaining her protective anonymity. That same March, the 332nd Fighter Group was flying missions in direct support of ground forces pushing into Germany. The work was different from the high-altitude bomber escort they had specialized in earlier. Lower, more dangerous, often involving strafing runs against ground targets and close air support for advancing troops. Lieutenant Washington, now a captain after a field promotion, led a flight of 4 aircraft on these missions. His Charcoal Express now carried 8 5-inch rockets in addition to its machine guns, weapons specifically designed to destroy the tanks and armored vehicles being used to slow the Allied advance. On March 7, 1945, Washington's flight was tasked with attacking German positions near Remagen, where American forces were attempting to secure a crucial bridge over the Rhine. The weather was marginal, low clouds and intermittent rain showers, but the mission was deemed too important to postpone. Visibility will be limited, Washington told his pilots during the briefing. Stay in formation until target identification, then standard attack pattern. If you lose sight of the formation, climb to 3,000 feet and orbit at the rally point until we can rejoin. The flight took off just after dawn, climbing through layers of clouds that reduced visibility to mere feet at times. Breaking into clear air at 5,000 feet, they set course for the target area, navigating by compass heading and time. As they approached the Rhine, Washington ordered a descent through the cloud layer to locate their targets. The 4 P-51s emerged from the clouds at 2,000 feet to find themselves directly over a German airfield that hadn't appeared on their maps. "Bandits on the ground," Washington radioed, spotting at least a dozen aircraft parked in dispersal areas around the field. "Target of opportunity, follow me in." He pushed his throttle forward and dived toward the field, lining up on a row of Focke-Wulf fighters being prepared for takeoff. His wingmen followed, spreading out to attack different sections of the airfield. The element of surprise was complete. No anti-aircraft fire greeted them as Washington triggered his machine guns, walking rounds across two aircraft that immediately erupted in flames. He pulled up sharply to avoid debris, banking around for another attack run. On his second pass, the Germans had recovered from their shock. Tracer fire reached up from multiple positions around the field. Washington felt his aircraft shudder as rounds struck the wings, but nothing critical seemed damaged. He fired his remaining rockets at a hangar structure, resulting in a spectacular secondary explosion that suggested a fuel or ammunition storage had been hit. "Blue flight, form up and egress to the west," he ordered after completing his attack run. "Mission accomplished." But as they climbed away from the target, Washington noticed his engine running rough, losing power. A quick glance at his instruments confirmed his fears. Oil pressure dropping rapidly, coolant temperature rising. His aircraft had sustained more damage than he had realized. "Blue led to flight. I'm losing power," he radioed calmly. "Continuing west, but we'll need to find a place to set down." "Blue 2 copies," his wingman responded. "I'll stay with you, sir." "Negative, Blue 2, Washington replied firmly. "Complete the primary mission. That bridge needs air cover. I'll manage." With reluctance, his wingman acknowledged the order. "Good luck, sir. We'll direct search teams to your location once we're RTB." Washington watched as the three remaining aircraft of his flight turned toward their original target, leaving him alone in enemy territory with a failing aircraft. He reduced power to minimum necessary and began looking for a suitable forced landing site. The Rhine was behind him, which was good. Being on the west side meant potential rescue by advancing Allied forces, but that was only relevant if he survived the landing and evaded capture long enough. The aircraft was descending steadily now, despite his best efforts. Through breaks in the clouds, he could see scattered farms and rolling hills. Then, just ahead, a relatively straight section of country road appeared, unobstructed by trees or power lines. It would have to do. Washington lined up on the road, lowered his landing gear and reduced speed as much as possible while maintaining control. The Merlin engine coughed and sputtered, then quit entirely as he made his final approach. The sudden silence was unnerving after hours of the engine's constant roar. The P-51 touched down hard, but remained intact, bouncing once before settling onto its landing gear. Washington braked carefully, bringing the fighter to a stop just short of a curve in the road. He sat for a moment, gathering himself, then quickly completed the shutdown procedure, more from habit than necessity since the engine had already stopped. He unstrapped, pulled his survival kit from behind the seat, and climbed out onto the wing before dropping to the ground. The area seemed deserted, but he knew that wouldn't last. A downed American aircraft would draw attention quickly. Washington needed to hide the obvious evidence of his identity, not just as an American pilot, but specifically as a black American pilot. His chances of survival if captured were slim in either case, but the latter would almost certainly guarantee mistreatment or worse. He considered destroying the aircraft, but decided against it. The smoke would only draw immediate attention, and there was no time for a thorough job. Instead, he gathered his essential gear, sidearm, compass, emergency rations, first aid kit, and most importantly, his sketchbook and pencils, and moved quickly toward a small wooded area about half a mile from the crash site. From the cover of the trees, Washington observed his surroundings. He appeared to be in a rural area with no settlements visible nearby. The cloud cover was breaking up, which would improve visibility, but also make him more exposed if he moved during daylight. His training dictated that he should hide during the day and move west toward Allied lines at night, using his compass for navigation. The front lines were fluid, but intelligence briefings had suggested American forces were advancing rapidly in this sector. If he could avoid capture for even a few days, he might find himself behind friendly lines again. As dusk approached, Washington heard vehicles approaching his downed aircraft. Peering carefully from his hiding spot, he saw two German trucks stop near the P-51. Soldiers spilled out and began examining the aircraft while others spread out, clearly searching for the pilot. Washington retreated deeper into the woods, moving as quietly as possible. He would need to put significant distance between himself and the search party before daylight. Using his compass to maintain a westerly heading, he began his journey toward what he hoped would be safety. For 3 days, Washington evaded capture, moving by night and hiding during daylight hours. He rationed his emergency supplies carefully, supplementing them with water from streams. The sound of artillery grew louder as he continued west, a promising sign that Allied forces were indeed nearby. On the morning of the 4th day, exhausted and hungry, Washington found himself on the outskirts of a small German village. His instinct was to avoid populated areas, but his supplies were nearly exhausted, and he needed information about the frontline positions if he was to have any hope of crossing safely. From a concealed position on a wooded hillside, he observed the village through field glasses from his survival kit. It appeared to be largely intact, suggesting it had been spared the heavy bombing that had flattened larger towns and cities. A church spire dominated the center, surrounded by perhaps 30 or 40 stone and timber houses. On the eastern edge, a small railway station stood empty, its tracks leading toward Frankfurt in one direction and toward the Rhine in the other. Most significantly, Washington saw no evidence of German military presence, no vehicles, no checkpoints, no uniformed personnel. This didn't mean the village was unoccupied by enemy forces. They could be billeted in houses or maintaining a low profile, but it suggested the possibility of civilians who might be less inclined to immediately report him. As he watched, an elderly man emerged from one of the houses, followed by a dog. The man moved with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who had nowhere particular to be, stopping occasionally to let his dog investigate interesting scents. They wandered toward the edge of the village closest to Washington's position. Washington made a quick decision. This isolated individual represented both risk and opportunity. He waited until the man had moved even farther from the village, then emerged from his hiding place, hands raised to show he was not an immediate threat. The old man froze, his dog growling softly. Washington remained still about 20 feet away, trying to project non-threatening intentions, despite his obviously American uniform. "Ich bin Amerikaner," Washington said, in the limited German he had learned during pre-deployment training. "Pilot." He pointed upward, then made a crashing motion with his hand. The old man studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Amerikaner," he repeated, then looked around nervously before gesturing for Washington to follow him. Washington hesitated. This could be a trap, but his alternatives were limited. Hunger and exhaustion were compromising his ability to evade capture, and winter nights in the German countryside were bitterly cold. He decided to trust his instincts about the old man and followed, maintaining enough distance to run if necessary. Instead of returning to the village, the old man led Washington to a small gamekeeper's hut nestled in the woods. Opening the door, he gestured for Washington to enter. The interior was spare but offered basic shelter: a wooden table, a chair, a small cot, a cast-iron stove. "Warten," the old man said. "Wait." He pantomimed eating, then pointed at Washington, then back toward the village. "Ich komm zurück." Washington understood. The man was offering to bring food. Again, he had to weigh trust against suspicion. The old man could be returning with soldiers rather than food, but the alternative was to continue his increasingly desperate journey without supplies. "Danke," Washington said simply. The old man nodded, then departed with his dog, leaving Washington alone in the hut. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. Washington alternated between watching through the single small window and resting on the cot. By mid-afternoon, he had convinced himself that the old man had indeed gone for authorities, and he was preparing to leave when he heard approaching footsteps. Peering through the window, he saw not the old man but a young woman carrying a basket covered with a cloth. She knocked softly on the door. Washington retreated to the corner of the hut, drawing his sidearm but keeping it hidden behind his back. "Herein," he called softly. The door opened and the woman entered. She was perhaps 25, with blonde hair tucked under a kerchief and an expression that mingled fear and determination. When she saw Washington, specifically when she saw his face, her eyes widened slightly, but she gave no other reaction to his race. "My father sent me," she said in heavily accented but understandable English, setting the basket on the table. "It is too dangerous for him to come. The patrols are searching for an American pilot." Washington kept his distance, still suspicious. "Your English is very good." I studied at university in Heidelberg, she replied. Before... She gestured vaguely, encompassing the war and all it had disrupted. Why are you helping me? Washington asked directly. The woman's expression hardened. My brother was taken by the Gestapo for speaking against the war. We have not seen him for 2 years. She began unpacking the basket. Bread, cheese, a flask of water, a blanket. Not all Germans believe in this madness. Washington finally holstered his sidearm and stepped forward. Thank you. My name is James Washington. I am Elsa Schmidt, she replied. You cannot stay here long. The patrols will search these woods soon. I need to reach the American lines, Washington said. How far west are they? Very close now, Elsa said. Perhaps 20 kilometers. But the roads are watched. You would need a guide to use the forest paths. Washington considered this information. Could you guide me? Elsa hesitated. It would mean leaving my father alone. I understand, Washington said. Perhaps you could just give me directions. Elsa was quiet for a moment, clearly wrestling with a decision. Finally, she said, There is another option. Come to our home after dark. We have a cellar where you can hide until the Americans arrive. It should not be more than a few days now. The offer was tempting but potentially disastrous for the Schmidt family if he were discovered there. That would put you at great risk. Elsa's chin lifted slightly. We are already at risk. Every day. Washington realized that for people like the Schmidts, who had already lost so much to the regime, the additional risk of sheltering him might seem marginal compared to the opportunity to strike a small blow against those who had taken her brother. I accept your offer, he said finally, and I thank you for it. Come to the edge of the woods after sunset, Elsa instructed. I will meet you there and bring you to our house. She moved toward the door, then paused. The American forces, they are treating civilians well. Yes, Washington assured her. They're under strict orders to respect non-combatants. Elsa nodded, seemingly relieved. Until tonight, then. After she left, Washington ate sparingly of the food she had brought, saving the rest for later. He took the opportunity to clean himself as best he could, with water from his canteen, and to rest properly for the first time in days. As the light began to fade, he packed his few possessions and prepared to leave. Following Elsa's instructions, he made his way to the edge of the woods as darkness fell. He didn't have to wait long before he saw her approaching, now wearing a dark coat that made her nearly invisible in the gathering gloom. Follow me, she whispered. Stay close. They moved through fields and along hedgerows, avoiding roads and open spaces. Washington was impressed by Elsa's confidence in navigating in the dark. After about 20 minutes of careful progress, they reached a small stone house set apart from the main village. Elsa led him to a back door, checking carefully before opening it and ushering him inside. The interior was dimly lit by a single oil lamp. The old man Washington had met earlier sat at a wooden table, rising as they entered. This is my father, Otto, Elsa said. He speaks no English. Washington nodded respectfully to the old man, who returned the gesture before speaking rapidly to his daughter in German. He says you must go immediately to the cellar, Elsa translated. It is safest there. She led Washington to a trapdoor concealed under a rug in the corner of the kitchen. Below was a small root cellar with earthen walls reinforced by wooden beams. A straw mattress had been placed in one corner, along with a bucket, a lantern, and some blankets. It is not comfortable, Elsa apologized, but it is safe. We will bring food when we can. It's perfect, Washington assured her. Thank you both. As Elsa prepared to close the trapdoor, Washington impulsively reached into his flight jacket and pulled out his sketchbook. Wait, he said, opening to a blank page. Let me give you something in return. With quick, practiced strokes, he began sketching Elsa's face. She stood perfectly still, watching with evident fascination as her likeness emerged on the paper. In just a few minutes, Washington had captured not just her features but something of her spirit, the quiet strength, the sadness behind her eyes, the determined set of her mouth. He tore the page from his sketchbook and handed it to her. A small thank you for your kindness. Elsa took the drawing with an expression of wonder. It is remarkable, she said softly. You are an artist as well as a pilot. In another life, Washington smiled. Before the war. For 3 days, Washington remained hidden in the cellar, emerging only briefly at night when it was safe to stretch his legs and breathe fresh air. Elsa and Otto brought him food and news. The American forces were indeed advancing rapidly, and German units were retreating in increasing disorder. On the morning of the 4th day, Washington was awakened by the sound of vehicles and shouting from above. For a terrifying moment, he thought the house was being searched, but then he recognized the language being spoken, English, with unmistakably American accents. The trapdoor opened and Elsa's face appeared, radiant with excitement. "They are here, the Americans have arrived." Washington climbed out of the cellar to find the kitchen occupied by 3 American soldiers, their expressions registering surprise at the appearance of a black American airman from the German family's cellar. "Well, I'll be damned," said a sergeant wearing the insignia of the 2nd Armored Division. "You must be the pilot they reported missing last week." "Captain James Washington, 332nd Fighter Group," Washington confirmed, saluting despite his disheveled appearance. The sergeant returned the salute. "Sergeant Miller, we're the advance patrol for Baker Company. The rest of the battalion is about an hour behind us." He looked at Elsa and Otto. "These folks been hiding you?" "Yes," Washington nodded, "at great personal risk. They're good people." Miller nodded. "We'll make sure they're treated accordingly." "Now I expect you'll be wanting transport back to your unit." "As soon as possible," Washington confirmed. As preparations were made for his departure, Washington took a moment to properly thank Elsa and Otto. The old man clasped his hand firmly, nodding his understanding despite the language barrier. Elsa walked with Washington to the military jeep that would transport him to the nearest field headquarters. "What will you do now?" Washington asked her. "Rebuild," she said simply. "And search for my brother if he still lives." Washington hesitated, then made a decision. He handed her his sketchbook. "There's an address inside the cover, my home in Philadelphia. When this is all over, if you need help finding your brother, write to me there." Elsa started to refuse, but Washington insisted. "Please, it would mean a lot to me to know you both are well." Finally, she accepted the book with a nod. "Thank you, Captain Washington." "James," he corrected her with a smile. "James," she repeated, returning his smile for the first time. With that, Washington climbed into the jeep, which soon pulled away, carrying him back toward his unit and the final phase of a war that was clearly approaching its end. As they drove through the village, he looked back to see Elsa still standing in the road, watching him depart, his sketchbook clutched against her chest. What neither of them could know in that moment was that a simple portrait drawn in gratitude would remain hidden for decades before emerging to connect their lives once more in a way neither could have imagined. July 14th, 1985. Frankfurt, Germany. The modern cityscape of glass and steel bore little resemblance to the war-ravaged town James Washington had last seen 4 decades earlier. Standing at the window of his hotel room, the retired Air Force colonel adjusted his tie and wondered if accepting the invitation to the reunification event had been a mistake. The German government had tracked down surviving Allied airmen who had operated in their airspace during the conflict, asking them to return as honored guests for an international reconciliation ceremony, but Washington could not shake the feeling that some wounds might be better left undisturbed. Across town, in a modest apartment overlooking the Main River, Margareta Keller née Schmidt, the woman once known as Elsa, carefully removed a framed sketch from behind the false panel she had installed in her dresser drawer 40 years earlier. Her weathered fingers traced the faded pencil lines of her own younger face, captured with such precision by the American pilot she had sheltered for those few crucial days. She had never told her husband about the drawing or the airman who had created it, carrying the secret through decades of marriage, even after Franz Keller's passing 5 years ago. For reasons she had never fully articulated even to herself, she had maintained the fiction that her name was Margaret, rather than Elsa, a small deception that had somehow made her feel safer in the uncertain post-war years. Now, as she prepared to attend the ceremony honoring the airmen who had once been her nation's enemies, she wondered if she might finally have the chance to return the sketch to its creator, if indeed he was among those returning to Frankfurt. The odds seemed vanishingly small, yet something had compelled her to retrieve the portrait from its hiding place after all these years. The Air Force reunion coordinator had been insistent when he contacted Washington at his home in Philadelphia. "Colonel, this isn't just any commemoration. The German Chancellor will be there. Several former Luftwaffe pilots are attending. It's about healing old wounds, building bridges." Washington had sighed, thinking of his arthritis and the long flight. At 71, he had lost the enthusiasm for such journeys. "I appreciate the invitation, Major, but I'm not sure what purpose it would serve." "Sir, if I may speak frankly," the young officer had continued, "you're one of the last surviving aces from the Tuskegee group. Your presence would mean a great deal, not just to the Germans, but to the younger officers in our own Air Force. The historical significance—" "I understand the historical significance," Washington had interrupted, perhaps more sharply than intended. "I lived it." There had been an awkward pause before the coordinator spoke again. "The Air Force would cover all expenses, of course, and there's a side event you might find interesting, an exhibition of war-related artwork at the Frankfurt Historical Museum. They've collected pieces from veterans on both sides." That had caught Washington's attention. After the war, he had finally completed his fine arts degree on the GI Bill, eventually becoming a professor at Howard University, where he taught studio art for 30 years before retiring. Throughout his academic career, he had continued to produce art related to his wartime experiences, with several pieces displayed in various museums across the United States. "An art exhibition, you say?" "Yes, sir. They're particularly interested in works that capture the human side of the conflict. The museum curator mentioned your name specifically. Apparently, your reputation as both an ace and an artist has not been forgotten." In the end, Washington had agreed, motivated more by curiosity than duty. Now, standing in his Frankfurt hotel room, he wondered again if he had made the right decision. The city outside his window held memories both harrowing and profound: his crash landing, his desperate evasion, and most significantly the unexpected kindness of Otto and Elsa Schmidt, who had risked everything to shelter an enemy combatant, a black one at that. Washington had tried to locate them after the war, sending letters to their village address, but had never received a reply. Eventually, he had to accept that they might have been displaced in the chaotic post-war period, or worse, had suffered reprisals for their aid to an American. The thought had troubled him for years. A knock at his hotel room door interrupted his reflections. Opening it, he found a young German woman in a formal business suit. "Colonel Washington, I am Brigitte Müller from the Ministry of Culture. I am assigned to escort you to the ceremony and the exhibition opening afterward." Washington retrieved his jacket from the bed. "Thank you, Miss Müller. I'm ready." As they walked toward the elevator, Brigitte spoke with obvious reverence. "It is a great honor to meet you, Colonel. My grandfather was a teenager during the war. He spoke often about seeing the American planes flying overhead, the ones with the red tails." Washington nodded, accustomed to such comments but never quite comfortable with them. "We were just doing our job like all the other pilots." "But under more difficult circumstances," Brigitte said quietly. "We learn about this in our schools now. How the American military was segregated, yet the Tuskegee pilots achieved such an impressive record." Washington offered a polite smile but changed the subject. "Tell me about the art exhibition. I understand they've collected pieces from veterans." "Yes," Brigitte brightened. "It has been a remarkable project. We have works from former soldiers and pilots from Germany, Britain, America, Russia, even a few from resistance fighters. Some are professional quality, others very simple, but all are authentic expressions of personal experience." "And my work? How did the curator know about it?" "Dr. Hoffman has been researching war art for many years. Your name appears in several academic papers on the subject. When we learned you were one of the few Tuskegee aviators still living, he was very eager to include your perspective." They had reached the lobby now, where several other elderly veterans were gathering, some in full uniform decorated with medals, others in civilian clothes with only small pins indicating their service. Washington recognized a few faces from American units he had encountered during the war, men who had aged just as he had, their youthful vigor replaced by the dignified weariness of survivors. A German official was organizing the group for transport to the ceremony venue. Washington found himself seated in a van with 3 other Americans and 2 elderly German men who were introduced as former Luftwaffe pilots. The atmosphere was initially tense, but as the van navigated through Frankfurt streets, one of the German pilots, introduced as Werner Gebhardt, leaned toward Washington. "You flew P-51s, yes?" he asked in heavily accented English. Washington nodded. 332nd Fighter Group. Gebhardt's weathered face broke into an unexpected smile. "The red tails. We knew you well. When we saw those red tails, we knew we were in for a difficult time." The other German pilot, Karl Müller, nodded in agreement. "It was a point of pride to engage with your unit. You were known to be among the best." Washington was momentarily taken aback by their frankness, then found himself appreciating their professional respect. "You flew Messerschmitts?" "I did," Gebhardt confirmed. 109G model mostly. Müller here was in Focke-Wulfs. 190 A8, Müller specified. Fine aircraft, though your Mustang had the advantage above 25,000 feet. What might have been an awkward encounter gradually transformed into a detailed technical discussion of aircraft capabilities, tactics, and shared experiences from opposing perspectives. By the time they reached the ceremony venue, an imposing 19th-century building that had somehow survived the wartime bombing, the former adversaries were engaged in animated conversation, using napkins to draw flight maneuvers they had employed against each other's forces. The commemoration itself was formal and diplomatic, with speeches from government officials emphasizing reconciliation and shared future rather than past conflict. Washington sat through it respectfully, though his mind occasionally drifted to more personal memories. Thompson's face the last time he had seen him, the cold nights hiding in the German countryside, the unexpected kindness of Otto and Elsa Schmidt. After the ceremony concluded, attendees were invited to the museum for the exhibition opening. The Frankfurt Historical Museum had dedicated its main gallery to the display titled "Through Their Eyes, The War in Art." As Washington entered with the other veterans, he was immediately struck by the power of the collected works. Sketches, paintings, even sculptures created by those who had experienced the conflict firsthand lined the walls and filled display cases. Some depicted combat scenes, others the quieter moments between, soldiers writing letters, civilians seeking shelter, prisoners gazing through barbed wire. Dr. Hoffman, the curator, a slender man with wire-rimmed glasses, approached Washington immediately. "Colonel Washington, what an honor. Your work has been given a prominent position." He gestured toward a wall where 3 of Washington's paintings hung, works Washington had shipped ahead at the museum's request. The first was a large oil painting depicting the view from a P-51 cockpit, looking down at clouds illuminated by sunrise with the distant silhouettes of bomber formations ahead. The second showed the airfield at Ramitelli, with ground crews preparing aircraft as pilots received their briefing under an Italian sky. The third was more personal, a portrait of Lieutenant Harold Thompson, completed after Washington had learned of his friend's death. "Your technique is remarkable," Dr. Hoffman commented. "The perspective in the cockpit view, it gives viewers a sense of what you experienced that few other works achieve." "Thank you," Washington replied, studying his own work with the critical eye he had developed over decades of teaching, "though I see flaws in them now." "Art is never truly finished, only abandoned," Hoffman quoted with a smile. "But please, explore the rest of the exhibition. I believe you'll find other perspectives quite illuminating." Washington moved through the gallery slowly, studying each piece, occasionally exchanging observations with other veterans. Near the center of the room, he paused before a collection of sketches created by a German soldier who had been stationed on the Eastern Front. The harsh conditions and desperation were evident in every line. He was so absorbed in the artwork that he didn't immediately notice the elderly woman who had stopped beside him until she spoke. "They capture the cold, do they not? I remember that winter, 1942. Even in Frankfurt, far from the front, people froze to death in their homes." Washington turned, prepared to offer a polite response, then froze. Despite the 40 years that had passed, despite the silver hair that had replaced the blonde, despite the lines that time had etched into her face, he recognized her immediately. "Elsa?" he said, barely above a whisper. The woman's eyes widened in shock. For several seconds she stared at him, her hand rising unconsciously to her throat. "James?" she finally managed. "Captain Washington." "Colonel, actually," he corrected automatically, then shook his head at the absurdity of such a response. "My God, Elsa, I looked for you after the war. I wrote letters." "We moved," she said quickly. "After the Americans came through, after you left, there was trouble in the village. Some people had seen you at our house. They called my father a traitor. We relocated to my mother's family home near Munich." "I'm sorry," Washington said, genuine regret in his voice. "I never meant to cause you difficulties." Elsa, or Margaret as she was now known, shook her head firmly. "No. We made our choice. We never regretted it." She hesitated, then added, "I go by Margaret now. Have for many years." Washington nodded, understanding the need for reinvention after trauma. "And your father?" "He passed in 1952. His heart." She smiled sadly. "But he lived to see Germany begin to rebuild, to see hope return." "And your brother? The one taken by the Gestapo?" Margaret's expression darkened. "We never found him. After the war, we searched the records, visited the camps after they were liberated. Nothing." She took a deep breath. "Eventually, we had to accept he was gone." Washington wanted to offer comfort, but knew no words could suffice for such a loss. Instead, he gestured to a nearby bench. "Would you sit with me for a moment? It seems we have much to discuss." As they sat, Washington noticed her hands, still elegant despite the years, but trembling slightly. "Are you here for the ceremony? I didn't see you earlier." "No," she replied. "I came for the exhibition. When I read in the newspaper that artworks from the war would be displayed, including some by American airmen, I thought perhaps—" She trailed off. "You thought I might be among them," Washington finished for her. "A rather extraordinary coincidence." "Perhaps not entirely coincidence," Margaret said carefully. "When I saw the announcement, I contacted the museum. I asked if they knew of a black American pilot who was also an artist. The curator, Dr. Hoffman, mentioned your name." Washington looked at her with newfound understanding. "You were looking for me?" "Yes," she admitted. "I have something that belongs to you, or at least, something you created." She opened her handbag and removed a flat package wrapped in acid-free paper. Carefully, she unwrapped it to reveal the sketch he had made of her all those years ago, remarkably preserved, though yellowed with age. The portrait was now mounted in a simple frame. "You kept it," Washington said, genuinely surprised. "All this time." "I kept it hidden," Margaret corrected. "During the occupation, it would have been dangerous to have a drawing made by an American, especially—" She hesitated. "Especially a black one," Washington completed her thought. "And afterward? Why keep it hidden then?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. "I married in 1949. Franz Keller was a good man, but traditional. He had served in the Wehrmacht, not by choice, but like most men his age. He was captured by the Russians, spent 2 years in a prison camp. When he returned, he wanted only to forget the war, to look forward. I never told him about you, about how my father and I had hidden an American pilot. It seemed simpler." Washington nodded, understanding the complicated choices people made to survive and move forward. "And you kept the drawing all this time?" "It reminded me of something important," Margaret said quietly. "That even in the worst of times, humanity can transcend the artificial barriers we create. National borders, racial differences, enemy designations." She carefully rewrapped the drawing and held it out to him. "It belongs with you now." Washington considered the package, then gently pushed it back toward her. "No, it was a gift, the only thing I could offer in return for your courage. But your sketchbook, you must have valued it greatly, and you gave it to me." "Did you keep that as well?" Washington asked, surprised. Margaret shook her head regretfully. "No." We had to leave quickly when we moved. Many things were left behind or lost, but I kept the portrait. Always. Their conversation was interrupted by Dr. Hoffman, who approached with evident excitement. "Colonel Washington, Mrs. Keller, I see you found each other. This is extraordinary." Both looked at him in confusion. Hoffman continued, "Mrs. Keller contacted me about an American pilot artist, but didn't know your full name. When she described the circumstances and mentioned a portrait, I suspected it might be you. I was going to make an introduction after your tour of the exhibition, but you've managed to find each other independently." Washington glanced at Margaret with raised eyebrows. "The world grows smaller by the moment." "Indeed," she agreed, then turned to Hoffman. "Doctor, would it be possible for Colonel Washington and me to continue our conversation somewhere more private?" "Of course," Hoffman replied eagerly. "You can use my office. And perhaps—" he looked at the wrapped portrait in Margaret's hands. "Perhaps that drawing might be considered for inclusion in our exhibition. A personal artifact connecting two people from opposite sides." Margaret hesitated, looking to Washington for guidance. "That would be Mrs. Keller's decision," Washington said diplomatically. "The drawing belongs to her." In Hoffman's office, a small room cluttered with books and artifacts, Washington and Margaret sat across from each other at a desk cleared hastily by the curator before he excused himself. "He's quite enthusiastic," Washington observed with a smile. "Germans can be very thorough when something captures their interest," Margaret replied, returning his smile. "Art history is his passion." There was a moment of awkward silence before both began speaking simultaneously. "I often wondered," Washington started. "After you left," Margaret began. They both stopped, then laughed, a tension-breaking sound that seemed to reset the conversation. "Please," Washington gestured for her to continue. Margaret gathered her thoughts. "After you left with the American soldiers, more troops came through our village. Most were respectful, but some were not. As I mentioned, certain neighbors had seen you at our house. There were accusations." "That must have been difficult," Washington said, feeling a renewed sense of guilt. "It was what it was," Margaret said with the pragmatism that seemed to define her generation. "We survived. Many did not." She looked at him directly. "And you? After you returned to your unit?" Washington leaned back in his chair. "I flew a few more missions before the German surrender. Then they sent us to the Pacific Theater to prepare for the invasion of Japan. But the atomic bombs ended the war before we were deployed into combat there. I stayed in the Air Force, flew in Korea, eventually reached the rank of colonel." "And your art?" Margaret asked, gesturing to indicate the museum beyond the office door. "I completed my degree after the war, taught at Howard University for 30 years. He smiled at a private memory. "I had students who changed how America sees art, while I remained rather traditional in my approach. But I kept painting, kept drawing, mostly scenes from the war, trying to capture what it was really like, not just the combat, but the waiting, the camaraderie, the fear, the moments of unexpected beauty. Like the sunrise from your cockpit," Margaret said, referencing the painting she had seen in the exhibition. "Yes, exactly." Washington studied her face, noting how the young woman from his memory had transformed into the dignified elder before him. "And your life? After you moved to Munich?" "I finished my education when the universities reopened, became a school teacher. Married Franz in '49, as I mentioned. We had 2 children. My daughter Hannelore lives in Berlin with her family. My son Karl is in Hamburg, a doctor." Pride crept into her voice. 3 grandchildren now. "A good life, then," Washington observed. "A fortunate one," Margaret corrected. "Many had far less. We rebuilt from ashes, literally. The Germany you see today, it is a miracle in many ways." "And a testament to resilience," Washington added, "both yours personally and your nation's." Margaret unwrapped the portrait again, looking at it thoughtfully. "Dr. Hoffman wants to display this. What do you think?" Washington considered the question seriously. "It's a piece of history. A small piece, but perhaps significant in its way. 2 people from opposing sides, sharing a human moment amidst inhumanity." "That was what I thought when I kept it," Margaret admitted. not just a reminder of those days, but of possibility, that the world need not be as it was. Washington nodded slowly. Then perhaps it should be seen. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of 4 decades somehow both heavy and lightened by their reunion. Finally, Washington spoke again. "Would you allow me to take you to dinner this evening? I'd like to hear more about your life, your family." Margaret smiled, a genuine warmth reaching her eyes. "I would like that very much, Colonel." "James," he corrected gently. "James," she repeated, just as she had 40 years earlier. When they emerged from Hoffman's office, the curator was hovering nearby, trying and failing to appear nonchalant. Margareta approached him with the unwrapped portrait. "Doctor Hoffman, we have decided to allow the drawing to be included in your exhibition, temporarily." Hoffman's face lit up with scholarly excitement. "Wonderful. And may I document the story behind it? A first-hand account from both of you would be invaluable." Washington and Margaret exchanged glances, a lifetime of experiences reflected in that brief look. "Yes," Washington answered for them both. "I think that would be appropriate." For the remainder of the afternoon, they recounted their story to Hoffman, who recorded their words with reverent attention to detail. The portrait was carefully mounted in a temporary display, with a placard explaining its significance, a small moment of humanity amidst a global conflict, preserved through decades of separation and silence. That evening, over dinner at a restaurant overlooking the rebuilt Frankfurt skyline, their conversation turned from the past to the present. "Your children," Washington asked, "what do they know of the war, of your experiences?" Margaret considered the question while sipping her wine. "Bits and pieces. Like most German families, we spoke of it reluctantly. The shame, you understand. Even for those of us who oppose the regime, there is collective responsibility that cannot be denied." "And the portrait? Did you ever tell them about that?" "No," Margaret admitted. "It remained my private memory. Until today." She looked at him curiously. "And you, did you marry, have children?" Washington nodded. "I married Eleanor in 1948. We had 3 children, all grown now, 7 grandchildren." He smiled. "My oldest son is an attorney. My daughter followed me into education, teaches history at a university in California. My youngest son is an Air Force pilot himself." "They must be proud of you," Margaret observed. "They know some of what we experienced during the war," Washington replied. "But like your children, there are parts they can never fully understand unless they lived through it. Perhaps that is for the best," Margaret said softly. The next day, the exhibition opened to the public. A newspaper photographer captured an image of Washington and Margaret standing beside the displayed portrait. The artist and his subject reunited after 40 years. The caption identified them simply as former adversaries, now friends. The photograph and accompanying story were picked up by international news services, appearing in papers across Europe and America. It was a perfect human interest story. The black American pilot and the German woman who had sheltered him, reunited through art decades after the war. In the following weeks, Washington extended his stay in Germany at Margaret's invitation. She showed him the rebuilt Frankfurt, introduced him to her daughter who traveled from Berlin to meet the American her mother had hidden during the war. They visited museums, attended concerts, and continued filling in the 40-year gap in their knowledge of each other's lives. One afternoon, Margaret took him to a small cemetery on the outskirts of Frankfurt. "My father was reburied here after we moved from the village," she explained, as they stood before a simple headstone. "I thought you might want to pay your respects." Washington placed a small stone on top of the marker, a gesture he had seen Jewish friends perform. "He was a brave man." "They both were. You and he." "He would have said we only did what was necessary," Margaret replied. "What was human?" "The two often coincide in the most difficult moments," Washington observed. As his extended visit drew to a close, the museum organized a small private reception for the veterans whose work had been displayed. Dr. Hoffman approached Washington and Margaret with evident excitement. "I have wonderful news," he announced. "The Ministry of Culture has approved funding for a traveling exhibition based on our collection here. Art from Opposite Sides will tour museums in Europe and America over the next 2 years, and they are particularly interested in featuring your story and the portrait as a centerpiece. Washington looked to Margaret. What do you think? Are you prepared to have your face and story travel the world? She laughed, a sound that momentarily stripped away the decades. At my age, James, I find I care less about privacy and more about meaning. If our small story can help others understand something important about humanity, then yes. Then we accept, Washington told Hoffman, who beamed with satisfaction. On Washington's final evening in Frankfurt, they sat together in the hotel lounge, reluctant to end their reunion. I have been thinking, Margaret said carefully, about your invitation. Washington raised an eyebrow. My invitation? To visit Philadelphia, to meet your family. She smiled at his surprise. You don't remember? You invited me to visit if I ever came to America. That was 40 years ago, Washington said, amazed she had recalled such a detail. Nevertheless, Margaret continued, my daughter thinks I should accept. She believes travel would be good for me, and I find I am curious about your country, not as it was during the war, but as it is now. Washington felt a surge of unexpected pleasure at the idea. I would be honored to host you. Eleanor would be delighted to meet you as well. Then it is settled, Margaret said with the decisiveness that seemed to characterize her approach to life. I shall come in the spring when it is warmer. My old bones do not tolerate cold as they once did. Washington laughed. Mine neither. On the day of his departure, Margaret accompanied him to the airport. As they waited for his flight to be called, she presented him with a small package. A parting gift, she explained. Something to remember our reunion. Inside was a modern sketchbook of high quality, bound in leather. The inscription on the first page read simply, For James, may you continue to capture moments that matter. With gratitude, Margaret. Washington was deeply touched by the gesture. I shall use it well, he promised. I expect to see the results when I visit, she replied with a smile. As his flight was announced, they embraced, a gesture that would have been unthinkable 4 decades earlier when they had parted as cautious allies in a world at war. Until spring, Margaret said firmly. Until spring, Washington agreed. On the flight home, Washington opened the new sketchbook and began to draw from memory, not the young Elsa from 1945, but the Margaret of today, with her dignified bearing and eyes that had seen a world destroyed and rebuilt. As his pencil moved across the paper, he reflected on the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together twice in one lifetime. The portrait took shape beneath his experienced hand, a woman transformed by time and history, yet recognizably the same person who had risked everything to help a stranger. When he finished, he studied the drawing critically, then wrote a caption beneath it. Margareta Keller, Frankfurt, 1985, Courage Doesn't Age. 6 months later, Margareta made good on her promise, traveling to Philadelphia for a 3-week visit. She met Washington's wife, Eleanor, his children, and several of his grandchildren. She toured his studio at their home, admired his collected works, and sat for a proper portrait, this time in oils rather than pencil. The traveling exhibition, Art from Opposite Sides, opened in Berlin that same year to critical acclaim. From there it moved to London, Paris, Rome, and eventually New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago. At each location, the simple pencil portrait that Washington had drawn of a young German woman in gratitude for saving his life drew particular attention. Museum guides told visitors the story of the black pilot and the German waitress, how she had hidden him from capture, how he had thanked her with his art, how she had preserved it through decades of silence, and how chance had reunited them 40 years later. Schoolchildren wrote essays about the moral of the story. Journalists penned thoughtful columns about reconciliation and human connection transcending conflict. In 1988, the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., requested the portrait for permanent display in their collection. After consultation with Washington, Margaret agreed to donate it, with the stipulation that it always be accompanied by the full story of its creation and rediscovery. At the dedication ceremony, now both in their mid-70s, Washington and Margaret stood together before an audience of dignitaries, historians, and family members from both sides of the Atlantic. When invited to speak, Washington kept his remarks brief. This simple drawing represents not my skill as an artist, but the capacity for human connection, even in the darkest of circumstances. Margaret and her father didn't see an enemy when I appeared at the edge of their village. They saw a person in need. That choice, to recognize humanity rather than nationality, is one we can all make in large and small ways every day. Margaret spoke next, her English now polished from regular correspondence and visits with the Washingtons. When James drew my portrait, I was a young woman in a defeated nation facing an uncertain future. I kept his drawing hidden because it represented hope I could not yet express openly. Hope that people could see beyond the artificial divisions that lead to conflict. That such a simple gesture could eventually lead us here, to this moment of friendship between our families and our nations, is perhaps the most valuable lesson of all. The friendship between Washington and Margaret continued for years, sustained by letters, occasional visits, and their shared connection to the traveling exhibition that kept their story alive. Their families developed their own bonds, with Margaret's grandchildren spending summers with the Washingtons in Philadelphia, and Washington's grandchildren visiting Germany in return. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II in Europe, Washington received a call from Margaret's daughter, Hannelore. Margaret had passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 76. Washington traveled to Frankfurt one last time for her funeral, bringing with him the sketchbook she had given him 10 years earlier, now filled with drawings he had created during their rekindled friendship. At the service, he presented it to her children. "Your mother once kept a drawing to remember our brief encounter during the war," he told them. "I kept these to remember the remarkable woman she became in peace." 2 years later, James Washington himself passed away. Among his personal effects, his family found a letter to be delivered to the Hoffman Museum in Frankfurt. Inside was his final painting, a dual portrait showing both Margaret as the young woman who had saved him in 1945 and as the elder who had reunited with him 4 decades later. The accompanying note requested that it be displayed alongside her original portrait if the museum wished. Today, visitors to the Smithsonian in Washington and the Hoffman Museum in Frankfurt can still view these artifacts of an unlikely friendship born in war and nurtured in peace. Docents tell schoolchildren the story of the black pilot who drew a portrait of a German waitress who kept it hidden for 40 years until chance brought them together again. It remains one of the most popular exhibits in both museums, a testament to the enduring power of human connection across the artificial boundaries of nation, race, and circumstance. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.